Alan was caged in again. Every time he turned to get away, there was another opponent. They were faster, smaller, and younger than he was. Even though they were well matched in numbers, his crew was about to get their butts whipped. He went in for a kill, only to get stuffed and served.
"Get behind him. Let's try that one again,"
Aaron, his captain, said as they huddled together.
"We've got these twerps. We aren't going to let a bunch of greasy-faced teenagers take us down, are we? It's now or never."
Alan knew they had to gain the higher ground again. He looked around, trying to avoid the watchful eyes, knowing the distraction could end up killing them.
"Break."
They parted ways as the buzzer sounded the timeout was over. When the ball was in motion again, he realized there was no way they were going to win. Those greasy kids were going to whip their butts. They made 3 more points to the teenagers' 5 before there was a squeal, causing the entire gym to look towards the bleachers. "Aaron, your wife's water just broke. You better get over here and take her in. You're having a baby," said Megan Jordan. She stood by the petite Lacey Stevens, who was past her due date and stood there holding her protruding belly. Aaron, along with Lacey's 2 brothers, Ian and Todd, rushed off the court and lifted her down gently from the bleachers. Luke and Alan stood there trying to catch their breath. They smiled and watched their friends all hover as Aaron carried his wife out the doors. Several of the women who had been cheering them on left. 2 women remained. They talked as the other team and the referee left.
"Is that Amber, the new manager for the Golden Oar?"
Alan slapped Luke's back as he looked at the pretty brunette. He kept trying not to look at the raven-haired beauty standing next to Luke's new girl.
"Yeah."
Luke smiled in her direction. Alan knew Luke and Amber had been seeing each other for about a month. Luke's grandmother had died recently, and he'd been going through a rough time. But seeing Luke smile and watching his eyes light up when he looked at Amber, he knew he'd gotten through the hardest part. The black-haired beauty standing next to Amber had been introduced to Alan before the game as Sara Lander, an old friend of Allison Jordan's. Sara had been born and raised in Pride, but for the past 3 years had been living in Seattle. He didn't know much more, but curiosity was killing him. Luke waved to Amber and started to walk towards the locker rooms. Alan followed him, trying to keep his eyes from traveling to the 2 women standing by the bleachers. He couldn't understand why he was feeling a pull towards Sara, but he was, and he was the last person to deny an instinct.
"So, you grew up here?"
Alan asked, while the 2 men showered in separate stalls.
"Yeah, I moved east after school and spent some time at MIT.
There was a moment of silence.
"Why?" "Well, I figured you could fill me in on what you know about Sara."
He tried to sound casual, but his friend easily caught on, and for the entire time they were in the showers and getting dressed, Luke gave him shit over it. He did get some useful information from his friend, but Luke spent most of the time getting back at Alan for all the shit he'd given Luke over the last few weeks about his feelings towards Amber. With the tables turned, Alan knew he was in for it. He just smiled and returned the humor when he could. When they walked out to the gym, Alan was a little disappointed to see Amber standing there alone, waiting for Luke. He watched the couple leave and felt a twinge in his chest. Why did it feel like he'd found everything he'd been dreaming of that fateful day when his chopper had gone down, except the one thing he desired most? He walked out, then hopped in his truck and checked his messages, while his truck warmed up in the parking lot. He enjoyed his job as company commander of the new Coastguard base. When he'd arrived that first day to check out the facility, he'd walked out on the beach and sat on a large piece of driftwood. He'd known instantly that he'd found the right spot. It had taken him several months to tie up loose ends and find a place to live. He'd been lucky to find an older house just on the outskirts of town that needed a little work. It had been easy enough fixing the house up. The new headquarters for the Pride Coastguard was a different story. It had taken almost a year to turn the old sawmill into the top-notch facility it now was. Over 1,000 recruits had come in and out of the front doors of that place last year. So many that they'd turned one of the outbuildings into barracks to house all the recruits. Now, less than a year later, they were building another, larger building to the south of the original facility to house even more recruits. They were also adding a large kitchen facility along with the medical center. The small town of Pride was growing bigger, thanks to the Coast Guard, and Alan was in charge of it all. There were those in town who didn't want over 200 recruits running around town, but for the most part, people seemed to appreciate the change and the added notoriety that came with having the Coast Guard at their doorstep.